Humdrummity, humdrummity, humdrummity.
Hello there, one and all. People are people unconditionally. We all have the capacity to be both good and bad, but we all can also find ourselves in relationships with others, both good and bad. As a podcast host, Nikki La Croce used the power of conversation to help herself discover the courage to leave a toxic and abusive relationship. Her online authenticity led her to find healthy love with a new life partner, then to share their experiences and dialogues together with a new online audience. Despite her trials and tribulations, Nikki continues to practice gratitude and find joyous moments in daily delights, no matter how big or small. Tune in to find out about the Hognoggle and if you should be doing it. Okay, sit back and let's listen in. Hi, Nikki. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Graham. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that it is a beautiful day in Vancouver today.
It is. We've been pretty lucky lately, that is for sure. Now, you, like me, are a fellow podcast host.
This is true.
This is true. Now, what I'd like you to do to start us off is please tell me the name of your current podcast, what the format is about, and why we should listen to your show.
Great question. So, my latest podcast is actually something that I co host with my wife, Nicole, and it's called Healthy Love. It's basically at this point, the two of us having a conversation, but we are going to be integrating guests into the conversation as well. The goal of the show for us is to really showcase what healthy love means and what it looks like. I came out of a long term relationship with a narcissist. Nicole had been single for a good portion of her life and had come out kind of in her early 30s. And so we were both at this really transformative point in our lives when we met. And we had done a lot of growth work up until that point, but not really understood what a healthy relationship looked like. And now that we have that, it's so undeniable and it makes everything else look so wrong by comparison. So, what we want is to help elevate awareness for people so that they understand that you don't have to settle, you don't have to lower your bar. You can find people who will meet you where you're at and respect the things about you that you care about and how important core values are in that process. So we're just getting started with that, and we've recently launched it on YouTube, and are kind of growing at a little bit of a slower pace because right now it's a bit of a passion project, but it is something that we really want to be able to dive into a lot deeper.
Yeah. So, what's the experience like being on a show with your partner and essentially exposing yourselves not only to each other, but to the audience? Is this kind of like, us getting a little, oh, if I were just a fly on the wall during this couples therapy session? Is that what what we're witnessing?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's a good question because the answer is yes, in that we talk about these things constantly, and it was sort of the catalyst for getting us to do the show. We were saying we have these conversations. They feel like they're so valuable, but we're not doing anything with them. And we love sort of the just to dive deep into thought and emotional conversations is part of what we consider intimacy in our relationship. So to be able to have that dialogue just in and of itself is really meaningful, but then to be able to share that with other people, it is vulnerable. And I think to your point, you are exposing certain things about yourselves in your relationship. But to me, that's something that is important to do. So many people, I think, feel uncomfortable talking about their relationships. I did, especially when I was in a bad relationship. Like you don't want to highlight the things that are going wrong when things are going wrong, right? So I think being able to say, hey, it's normal to talk about the fact that you have conflict. We talk a lot about the fact that we have different conflict styles, and so part of what we're doing is unlearning the way that we approach things so that we can have more effective conversations between us. And so our hope, I think, is that we can not just share our experiences and have somebody witness that, but in some way, not to say that we're the ultimate standard, but in some way model to people what it could look like if you're having some of these hard conversations and working through that. And we've definitely tapped into certain parts of who we are leading up to episodes that we record where it's like, I really think we should talk about this because I'm uncomfortable with how that interaction happened. And it's not something that we want to walk away from it and just be like, oh, that happened, no big deal. It's like we really should confront some of this stuff. And what if we did it on the mic so that other people understood that it's safe to talk about this?
That's pretty brave. I don't know if I would be so brave to sit down with Mrs. Humdrummedy in such a environment and then have that recorded. Now, when you come up, you're going to do an episode. Do you and your partner, Nicole, first decide what you're going to talk about before you start the episode, or do you kind of surprise each other with like, "Hey, I want to ask you about this," and you're sort of on the spot, or have you sort of pre-decided what the topic of that episode will be and where you hope to take it?
Really, interestingly enough, we've kind of done both and realized that we need a little bit more preparation. Um, because I'll be real, I'm like the worst version of myself when I'm setting technology up and having to then also kind of converse on the fly and hope that we're getting the talking points that we want. Nicole can be very patient with me, but then she's also not as used to podcasting. So I think between the two of us, our initial hope was like, we'll just talk. We'll just have the conversation that we normally have. But when you do that, it's so much easier to veer off and then lose the point of what you're saying. So I'd say we do a little bit of a hybrid model. We sort of go in and say, this is the topic we want to discuss. Here are some main points that we want to try to tackle if the conversation lends itself to that. But then we do also leave space for there to be really organic in the moment dialogue, because I think in a lot of cases, those are the moments where we sometimes even surprise ourselves, or we get to ask a question of, well, how did you feel about that? Or what were you thinking when that happened? And it's actually holding us more accountable to some of the things that we wouldn't probably have talked about if we weren't sitting there having this conversation trying to explain it to somebody else. So it's been, to your point about, is it sort of like couples therapy? Kind of. I think there's definitely more exposure to topics that we might have maybe brushed off, not in an avoidant way, just in a, oh, I don't know that we need to necessarily talk about that anymore. And it's added layers of depth to our relationship that are really important.
Now, and a lot of couples, maybe not a lot, but there are quite a few couples that work together, run a business together, um, but they don't do it so openly to be exposed for other people to see. And also, the work isn't necessarily about them talking to each other about each other. So, what's the stresses on the relationship of a working dynamic like that?
Oh, that was a journey. It still is. I think it always and forever will be a journey. When we started working together, it wasn't on the podcast. Nicole's an entrepreneur. She's had her own business for 14 years at this point, I think probably longer. And we because of how we just engage on a day-to-day basis, I think we kind of assumed that it would be easier to just sort of integrate into a work mode together. But Nicole has primarily worked independently for most of her career as a solo entrepreneur. She has an employee now, so it's a little bit different. But for me, most of my career has been spent collaborating with people in very dynamic environments where you're meeting a lot, or you're whiteboarding and you're kind of putting all the thoughts together. And so one of the biggest challenges that we've faced is that for Nicole to have a lot of clarity of thought and strategize and sort of bring things to fruition, she needs independent time. For me, I need more collaborative time. And so a big part of what we had to learn kind of early on, and there was a lot of tension, was trying to find out, okay, how do we collaborate so we can strategize and then part ways so that we can sort of get the day-to-day stuff done and reconvene. And I think the biggest sticking point for both of us is realizing that we have to be conscious and intentional of having regular meetings or touch bases on things, because we will both sort of go off in our own direction and not reconvene. And if we don't have a very clear, this is what I'm expecting you to do, this is what I'm expecting me to do, then it can sort of be like, well, where is that? What's going on? Right. So I think what it did was really show us where there was a lack of communication that we needed to modify and create more just structure around. Because when you're just going about your day-to-day life with your partner, I mean, yeah, sure, maybe you put something on the calendar, but um in terms of working together, it's like, yes, you're putting things on the calendar, and now we also have deliverables that we're each accountable to. And I think that was for a while, I'll be real, Nicole was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to work together if this is what we're like, because when I get stressed about stuff like this, I can be snappy. Like, I've really got to own that. I'm not It's something that I'm actively working on, and I also know that the way I describe it is sort of like when I get really stressed, it's like you've shaken a can of soda and you've got 2 options. Like, if you open it right away, you just gotta get out of the blast radius because it's happening, or like, tap me on the head a little bit, give me a second to settle down, and then we can have a calm conversation. But when I can be a bit impulsive in my responses, especially when it comes to technology stressors, that was where it was she was basically saying to me, we need you to be able to figure out how to navigate these types of stress for me to feel comfortable working with you because I feel like I'm just like waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I could tell because it made it harder for us to collaborate because I'm like, oh, she's tense, she's guarded, she's worried about how I'm going to respond to something. And then that's making me annoyed that we can't just get this work done because you're anticipating a response that I don't think I'm going to have this time. So it's definitely been a learning curve for both of us. And I think that we've for the most part gotten over that hump. But I will say, I think as in any relationship, work or personal, there's always sort of room for continued growth, and we're learning that as we go.
Yeah, yeah. It is interesting. You have to do your growth as a couple, both personally and professionally. Now, for the listeners, do you have any sort of practical tips and tricks for navigating that situation together?
Yes. Okay. So I love that you asked this because I feel like it's on brand for humdrummity. So one of the things that Nicole and I have implemented is what we call a hognoggle, and it's a nothing word. It means absolutely nothing.
Okay, okay. I thought that
Emo-
might have been German for
no,
some crazy,
you know what?
Germans do
It
have those
might be.
words. Yeah.
I've Googled it, so I think it means nothing. Hopefully, nothing offensive at the very least. But so we we came up with this word. To be honest, it came out of like a very different situation where it was just like a random game that you play. You match like a symbol with a made up word, and just kind of a thought experiment. What do you think this word represents? So hognoggle was this word that basically, when we're in a moment where we know that tensions are high and things are about to get more uncomfortable. Nicole's somebody who needs space. I historically have been somebody who like I'm chomping at the bit, like I want to solve this right now. I need to address this immediately. And basically to say, you know what? Both of us realize that we're not going to get anywhere productive in this moment. We need a hognoggle. So we just say hognoggle, be like, basically take a 5-minute break or however long you need, and we'll come back around. It's essentially a way to say, I can't do this right now. I don't have the capacity to do this right now. I'm not going to say the things in the best possible way and make anything positive come of this. So let's take a beat, reconvene when we're ready. And the reason I really like this method that we've come up with is because it's an indicator that we're coming back to it. It's not I'm avoiding it. It's not I'm not talking to you about this right now because I'm also somebody who could be like, I'm not in the headspace right now. And Nicole would be like, when will you be in the headspace? So it's really eased tension a lot in our relationship because the other part of it is you cannot say the word hognoggle and not kind of giggle a little, at least in your head even, because you're like, it's so ridiculous. And so it immediately lightens the tension just because of the nature of the word. And then it also signals to each of us, okay, we're not really showing up as the best versions of ourselves right now. So let's come back around to this when we're both ready for it. And I think that's honestly been like a monumental improvement to our relationship.
Right. Hognoggle. Okay. Well, hopefully more people will hognoggle in the future.
We're promoting it,
You're, you're,
I advise anyone who thinks it's a good idea to take a hognoggle, and if hognoggle is not the word for you, find out what one is. But I think the concept in general has been really helpful to keeping our relationship in a really healthy place.
now, you currently have your podcast, Healthy Love,
Yep.
but I believe it's Healthy Love with Nick and Nick.
Yes, correct.
How did you determine which Nick got to go first? Because it's Nick with NIC and Nick with NIK, and you're the NIK. Did you flip a coin? Did you arm wrestle? What'd you do? How'd you figure that one out?
That's funny. So early on in our relationship, we actually we realized we have the same name. So we're both Nicole Marie. And we I jokingly said when we were because we met and we were friends first, I jokingly had sent her a voice memo being like, "Ooh, how should we brand this?" And so it was sort of this, a little bit of foreshadowing into what we were gonna end up doing, um, between us in terms of a business perspective, both being entrepreneurial. And so I think when we first established that we were dating, Nicole immediately was like, here are some of the domain names that I was thinking that we could use. And so Nick and Nick, the way it is, was available. But also, I think we sort of established visually the way that we liked it, sort of how it looked. It was just more of a function of this sort of makes the most logical sense aesthetically. It was available, I guess, in terms of what the domain names were. So it was pretty just sort of off the cuff, and we both rolled with it. I don't know that either one of us thought too much about whose came first. But to be fair, Nicole did send me the domain name, so maybe she had a plan all along. I don't know.
But okay, you say your name, your actual given name is Nicole,
Mhm,
and then you change because you go by Nikki with Nikki.
correct.
When did you make that change in your life, and was there a reason behind that?
No, I'm basically my parents said to me like from the moment I was born, I was Nikki. So that was more them than me. And I think for me, being called Nicole growing up was I was in trouble. Or my grandparents were calling my name. Nobody really called me Nicole throughout most of my life, and for Nicole, she really didn't like being called Nikki when I guess people attempted that with her. And for the most part, with our friends and family, everyone calls each of us Nick. So it's it's funny because generally speaking, you don't really think too much about it until you're in a room with somebody's family or friends, and then they say it, and then you're like meerkats, just sort of which one are you referring to? And obviously, if we're with my family, we assume it's me. If we're with her family, we assume it's her. But it definitely was a little bit of an adjustment period there because nobody really calls either of us by our full names unless we're together, I think, to make the distinction. We're both Nicole Marie in first and middle name. And so we didn't take each other's last names because, to be honest with you, we both hate a hassle. And I can't even begin to fathom the nightmare that getting mail would be if our names were the same. Legal documents. I mean, we've had issues where like our party story sort of that people who've met us and they're like, "Oh my gosh, Nikki and Nicole." And then we're like, "Yeah, it's actually exactly the same name." And then we get the same question of, "Oh, what about your last names?" So because I'm from the States and Nicole's a Canadian, we have to cross the border quite a bit. And so we were going over one time and the from Canada to the US. And the border guard was like, "Okay, which one of you is Nicole?" And we're like, "Both of us." "Which one of you is Nicole Marie?" And we're like, "Both of us." And he's like, "Which one of you is the Canadian?" Like, it was just like it so that instance alone was so indicative of what a nightmare it would be if the last name were also the same. I was like, "We will get pulled over every single time we try to travel somewhere. It's just not worth it." And to be honest with you, I think both of us, we have kind of unique last names, so it also bodes well for us in terms of just sort of as we're building out businesses or content related stuff, it helps create a differentiator for us when we're kind of showing up professionally. So then that also makes it easier for other people to identify who's who.
Yeah, that's that is just that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. We did our best to just
But
make it
fun.
as convenient as possible, given that it's going to create issues if we make our names the same. And frankly, just it's hard enough for people to get either of our names right. So we're like, it's fine, just leave it.
Just leave it. That's yeah, that's I really like that. That's pretty even though it's the same, it's very unique.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so before you started your current podcast, you were the host of a podcast called Can I Just Say?
Yes.
That went on. You did that for quite a while. You interviewed over 100 people for that.
Yep.
And your final episode was called A Love Letter to My Podcast, Saying Goodbye with Gratitude. What made you decide to move on from that specific podcast to your current project?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So, I started my podcast in 2019 because I had been just in a really unfulfilled place. I To give a little bit of context, I had moved out to Seattle in 2017. I was working at Amazon corporate, and for a long time, I kind of had settled into a corporate career that I never really ultimately wanted. I took the opportunity with Amazon so I could leave the East Coast. I've always wanted to live on the West Coast. About a year into that, I was really just recognizing how I felt like I was lacking purpose. And so I had started going to therapy. And about a year into therapy, I was like, you know what? I think my purpose, at least in some way, is to connect with people. And at first I started writing a blog, but I have a graveyard of blogs I've started and not gone anywhere with because I realized that writing out sort of into the void, needing to sort of express, but not really having any sort of engagement from that. Sure, yes, people do engage with content like that, but I wanted to be having conversations with people. I wanted to actually feel the connection happening and also to be able to witness the impact that it can have on other people. And so when I started podcasting, the show was actually called, I don't know in terms of profanity here, but it was called Who the Fuck? And the whole premise was like, who am I? And I really started to unpack who I am. I rebranded because I realized how much censoring was happening as a result of the name. Unfortunately, I did that later than I probably should have. But a word to the wise, anybody who's listening and wants to podcast, be very cognizant of that. It will get censored, and it's important to have good keywords so people can find you. I also think that it didn't really explain to people, even though I knew what it meant. I think a lot of people were like, it's edgy. And I was like, I'm not edgy. I'm just not an edgy person. And at the time, though, I sort of had like spiky hair and, I have funky glasses and the title of this show, and people are like, "Oh yeah," but they don't know what it's about, right? The whole premise of the show was share your story with me. Tell me how you've become who you are. And in that process, I learned so much about myself. It was actually really quite pivotal in terms of helping me realize that I was not only unsatisfied in my career, but I was unsatisfied with the relationship that I was in, the marriage that was, quite frankly, very, very psychologically abusive. And I learned this through the lens of other people's stories, their resilience, their ability to show up for themselves in spite of everything else, and with the intention that they wanted better. And so what it became about was really what happens when you prioritize yourself. And so as I was getting deeper into this process, I was really like, okay, I think that this needs to be more about, what are the things that people want to say that they don't get the chance to say. As a podcaster, I'm sure you've witnessed this in some capacity. A lot of times people sort of share the same story, wherever they're going. If somebody's promoting something, I understand, to some degree, having similar talking points, that's a necessity to do it. But I really wanted to make sure, because a lot of the feedback I was getting was, "You're really authentic. You made me feel so comfortable. I've never shared this before." So the reason I rebranded to Can I Just Say was because I felt like it was more representative of the space that I was holding for people to say the thing that doesn't always get the airtime. And the reason I ended up pressing pause on that, or stopping ultimately, was because I could see that I was passionate about having the conversations, but I was lacking focus in terms of turning it into something that was more than a hobby, sort of masquerading as a business. And it kind of gives me an ick to even say it because I really put so much effort into it. It was a full-time job that I wasn't really monetizing, because podcasting, so many people will be like, everybody has a podcast. Okay. But a lot of people use podcasting as a mechanism for marketing, and that's the primary purpose. I think similar to you, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to speak on your behalf, but from our conversation, it's like you're doing this because you like to do it. You want to connect with people, you want to have good, meaningful conversations. That doesn't sell something to people. And I was like, I don't wanna just force a square peg in a round hole to tell a group of people who are listening to this to buy something from me. Like, that
Mm.
doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel aligned. And so what I realized was I'm only gonna be able to take this podcast so far in the way that I'm doing it right now. And it was really hard to justify continuing to do that when I didn't have the bandwidth to also be making a reasonable income, it would have been kind of 2 full-time jobs. And so I think I got to a place where I was able to acknowledge that Nicole and I really wanted to find a way to work together. I really wanted to be able to keep podcasting, but I didn't want to shove something like some sort of offer into the podcast that I already had. It felt like a natural turning point for me
Mm.
to build something new, both for myself and with Nicole. And then from there, it just sort of evolved into everything else that we're doing together. We had a couple of ideas that even before our podcast happened, we were like, "What about this? We'll do this. We're going to build a community. We're going to, sell these products," and a lot of things sort of just morphed over time. And we landed on Healthy Love, which was an idea that we had years ago and came back to now. And so I think it was just the natural progression of things ultimately, but it was certainly um, I think the long-term vision started to crystallize more, where I lacked that clarity in the earlier seasons of the show. I just really thought if it was good enough that I could get the listenership, I could get the audience, and I could monetize from there. But the reality is that a lot of these conversational podcasts that you see that are so big, it's because these people already had an audience. They already had a book or they already had notoriety. And because of that, they've drawn the audience in. When you are somebody who people don't generally know, interviewing people that people don't generally know, you have a much steeper hill to climb to get people invested in the story.
Yeah. Now, your old podcast, can I just say, is still available online.
Yes.
So in a way, uh, it's not like it's not a blog, but it still is an entity that lives on. Do you look at it as a legacy? As if, a writer wrote a novel, right? They finished that novel, it's published, they now move on to the next book. Do you see that podcast as a legacy for you that you will continue to keep online that for people to
Mhm.
find?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question because I was considering this actually within the past week because my to be quite candid, my hosting subscription needs to update. And so I was like, I don't know. Do I want to keep it up there? I think these conversations are important. They're valuable. They're available on YouTube for the most part as well, from the second season onward. So, I think for me, it is, I hadn't considered it sort of the way that you just expressed. I think the parallel to somebody who's an author is a really good way to kind of drive this conversation. I think it is sort of a legacy, though I don't know that I ever set out to create a legacy, if that makes sense. I think that for me, what I love about it is at any point if I wanted to, though I'm as a host, I think sometimes it's hard to go back and listen to yourself, but if at any point I wanted to, I could kind of go back to a moment in my life and reflect on that and say, "Okay, that's where I was at that point." And, Nicole and I were actually talking about this just last night because my podcast was actually a very big contributor to why we ended up being friends and ultimately being together. When we met, I was just out of this last relationship, and I was just kind of trying to see what was out there, and I had a podcast, we met online, and Nicole was like, "Oh, I love podcasts." So she actually had listened to, I wanna say, my 1st and 2nd seasons before I really got to know her more, and so she was saying she had kind of an upper hand where she was able to be like,
Mhm.
"I understand who you are fundamentally as a person before you really knew who I was." But for her, that was really valuable because she said, "I was able to really see that who you were there was exactly who you are when you were showing up with me." So I think in a lot of ways, if for no other reason I did the show was so that could all unfold the way that it did, I'm totally cool with it. That can be the legacy. But I think, part of what I'd love to be able to do when I have more bandwidth is take out some of the more valuable pieces of information from those episodes and create more short form, mid form content for people because I think what I lacked, or I'm very aware what I lacked in putting that content out originally was the capacity to generate that. And I think it's very hard to get people invested in an hour plus long episode. Again, when they don't really know you, they don't know what you're about. Like I want people to just have the value that came from those conversations. So, in terms of the full episodes, that's almost less important to me. I'd love for people to keep listening to those, but I'd like to be able to really expand on the value that they initially provided too, because I learned so much about myself from other people sharing their stories. And I think that taking, a 5, 10, 15-minute clip from some of those shows could be really, really profound for people who are listening and looking for some answers or relatability.
Mm, mhm. Do you think also that the end of Can I Just Say may have coincided with the end of the journey that you were on as to why you started that podcast? Because my understanding is you were previously, and I'm not sure if you started the podcast while you were still in your previous
I
relationship,
did.
but you were in a toxic relationship. So was the sort of genesis of that podcast a way for you to, get through, get over, get out of that previous relationship?
I actually just got goosebumps when you said that because yes, absolutely. I think that's a very astute question and observation in that regard. I didn't know it at the time, but yes, because the other thing that I think is really important to note with this is that when I was doing the podcast. So I started it in 2019. Then COVID peaked, right? So we were not connecting with people nearly as much. But
Hmm.
that is also when things were the absolute worst in the relationship that I was in. So there was a lot of isolation socially because of the world being dealing with what it was dealing with. And then the person that I was in this relationship with had a lot of really crazy events going on that were causing me to struggle a lot. And so while I was in therapy and I was navigating through that, I think I've said to a lot of people that the podcast was a life raft for me at that point in my life, but I didn't know it at the time. I didn't understand the immense impact that it was having on me because it was sort of subliminal almost,
Mm.
in that these conversations I was having with people who had overcome addiction, who had been in abusive relationships, who had dealt with disabilities, who had, just like insert crazy life event or transformative moment here, it started to just show me this power of resilience and the strength of the human spirit and how we can decide different for ourselves. And so it absolutely influenced my ability to leave that relationship. It gave me a lot of perspective that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and it kept me connected in a time where people were actively disconnecting, both because we had to, but also a little bit by design. We all sort of fell into our own worlds in those moments, and in a situation where I was living with somebody who was just not capable of being a good partner, what I had was the other connections, and those people were making me feel seen and holding space for me while I held space for them, and I I honestly feel like in a lot of ways it saved my life, like, because the relationship was so traumatic in a variety of ways that I honestly can't fathom what it would have been like if I didn't have all these touch points that helped me see what was really going on. Plus, again, the support from a very, very, very good ethical qualified therapist, basically kind of navigating all of that with me. And so it's sort of the way that I came out of that really tragic time because my mom also passed away during that
Mm.
time very suddenly. It was like everything just sort of the dominoes fell the way that they were supposed to. And at the end of the day, I can look back on those conversations and say, like, that strengthened my spirit and that gave me an opportunity to witness what it looks like to choose yourself.
So the combination of having quality therapy was part of it, but also having these new connections through your podcast that you might not otherwise have had because of your relationship maybe. And as you say, we were in COVID, so you weren't able to have these daily face to face with people, gave you an ability to grow and get out of that situation. Now, I don't want to make you emotionally relive your past through that, but it, you know, it's interesting that you talk about you came from an abusive relationship, and this may be as a result of the mainstream media things that we think about, but we often don't think about a lesbian or same-sex marriage between two women having an abusive relationship. It's automatically, as soon as you say abusive relationship, you immediately think a male female relationship with an abusive, overbearing man, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that is a result of our sort of, cultural conditioning?
Yeah.
Can you see there being, a place for a voice for us to understand more about relationships? That a relationship is just a relationship about two personalities coming together, trying to navigate through the world.
Yes, I think that's a really important conversation to be having because when I was going through the divorce, which was really, really tumultuous, one of my close friends who had been in a similar relationship with a narcissist who's a little bit older than me, and I hadn't even known it until we were speaking about the situation I was in. She said to me, I exactly what you did, which is, of course, logically, that that can happen. Anybody of any gender can be an abusive person. That's fact, right? But I think when we think about abusive relationships, there is sort of the perspective in a heteronormative society that there is typically a male abuser and a female who is being victimized. That's not to say the inverse can't be true because I also have witnessed that. But I think being in a same-sex relationship, the thing is abuse takes many forms. And so when I speak to being in an abusive relationship, for the most part, I was in this relationship for about 12 years, and it was very emotionally abusive early on, but I didn't know enough at the time to understand that. And so the terms like narcissism or gaslighting or even just the concept of emotional abuse wasn't in the lexicon the way that it is now.
Mm,
So if I had understood what gaslighting was when I was in my early 20s, jumping into this relationship with a lot of insecurity that I was holding on to, the desire to really feel seen and loved by somebody, maybe I could have recognized that this person is love bombing me and gaslighting me, but those words weren't in my vocabulary. And I kind of typical person who is victimized in a situation like this, I blamed myself for certain things,
mm,
right? I also had reactivity. Like I'm an impulsive person. As I said, even with my wife, Nicole, now, like I really have to be aware of how I respond outwardly because I can be intense. But it was a bigger challenge with the person I used to be with because she also was a behavioral specialist for children with autism. So she had a degree in psychology. She knew
mm,
how to manipulate people. And I look back on it now and I just think, it was really insidious. And over the years, there ended up being substance abuse issues. I mean, ultimately, she was living a double life, and
mm,
the signs were there. But I was both in many ways naive because I didn't know what to look for. She played off the fact that she had been through certain traumas. I TBD how much of it was true or not. There was a lot of lying. So to be fair, whether or not she deserved that, I do think like there was probably some stuff that was true about what she shared with me, but then leveraging that to manipulate me so that I would sort of concede. I would stop fighting if I could see that there was something that I was being gaslit about. There were so many micro manipulations that were happening that you can't keep your head above water long enough to observe objectively and pull yourself out of it. So the moment that I was really able to fully pull myself out, I left and I went to go live with my sister for a couple of months. Um, I flew cross country in the middle of COVID pre-vaccine because I was like, I need to get out of here. And it was being away in that moment, having the actual support in person that helped me really unravel everything that had been going on. And then when we lost my mom and the way this ex was behaving, I really was kind of like begging for her support in the moment, and she like kind of half showed up, but then was exactly who she was in terms of the making everything about her while my mom had just passed away. And it was just there was no more negotiating at that point. And so when I got home after this period of time and I said that I wanted it to be over, she ended up ultimately physically assaulting me. And that was the like, I mean, it had already been done, but I think when we talk about the abuse, it's like there was over a decade of emotional abuse. And then the like final thing that like really hammered it home was now there's been physical assault. And I was on the board for a nonprofit for survivors of domestic abuse because she had told me that she had been in an abusive relationship. So I was, as an advocate, joining this board not even realizing that I am in an abusive relationship while I'm advocating for people who are in abusive relationships. And then it just sort of all was like, oh my God, everything's kind of coming like a tidal wave at me with the realization. And so, sorry, it was kind of like a long winded way of explaining it because there's so many details and I try to find like the fastest path to it. But I think all of this to say it can happen very, very subtly. But when it comes down to it, like I think there's always kind of ultimately a very I don't want to say explosive necessarily in terms of the output of it, but there's sort of like a critical moment where there's just no denying it anymore. And then once you see it, I think the people around you feel more comfortable acknowledging that they were seeing it too.
That sounds like a terrible environment to, be having a relationship in and trying to work your way out of it. But you have gone through it. You've gotten out of it. You've come out stronger. You're now in a new, happier relationship, working together on a podcast. One of the things I wanted to speak to you about that, and I know this is sort of near and dear to your heart, but is this idea then when you are together making time for play
Yeah.
to then have, living a healthy and balanced life.
Yeah. I think one of the things that has been so instrumental to our relationship being healthy, especially because we can both be so absorbed with what we're doing from a work perspective, is making sure that we're mindful of that time that we create, that we're intentional about creating time to play. So this is something that I actually learned in therapy too. Not that it's not necessarily obvious to people outside of that context, but it was I felt like I was kind of given permission to play. Like, it's important for us not to just kind of go about our day-to-day, the humdrummedy, right? Like, it's having being with a partner who is playful. I think I said to you when we first spoke that Nicole often says, like, "What's life without whimsy?" And I love that because I think it gives you the freedom to sort of explore ideas to like, we'll play games, sure, like, we'll play board games or card games or things like that to kind of mix things up, darts or games outside when the weather's nice, but we'll also just make up random games. We'll be like, "Oh, this is fun." Okay, so the other day, um, I was playing a video clip and she said, "Oh, who is that?" And, trying to so then we decided we would play a game where it's like, I'm gonna play a quick interview clip and you're gonna tell me which celebrity it is, right? So, like, we're kind of in this flow of letting a moment guide us towards how we're playing and what does it look like for us to sort of be creative in those moments as well. Because I think, it's one thing to be like, let's go out and go bowling or, go do something like go for a hike and be a little bit more playful. I think being out in nature is super important. And I think that's
Mhm.
really freeing for me for sure. But I think when it comes down to it, how you play with your partner is ultimately determined by like what things do you enjoy together that make you feel more vibrant, that give you sort of like a childlike wonder or make you feel sort of silly. And when you're in adulthood, so much of our life is guided by what we should be doing and how we should be acting. And I think to be with somebody who is so free spirited and invites that aspect in, I felt so much more safe to show that part of myself as well. And we always joke around that one of the things that is such an important component of compatibility with your ideal partner is that you're the same kind of weird.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, one of the things you speak about, and I think this has been an ongoing theme for you, is this idea of practicing gratitude.
Mhm.
What, do you think expressing gratitude is different for different people? Because for one, when I hear that, oh, express gratitude, I'm like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, oh, hey, thanks for doing that. Like,
Yeah.
what can we do to actually get some benefit? And not to feel like it's some kind of, because people talk about meditating. Well, meditating is like, okay, you got to make the effort. Is expressing gratitude something easy that we can just do in the moment?
I say yes to that because the moment that was really transformative for me in terms of recognizing the value of gratitude was I've mentioned therapy a lot. It's been beneficial for me. So my therapist said to me, gratitude and anxiety can't exist at the same time. Great. So when you are feeling really anxious, and at the time in the relationship that I described, clearly there's going to be quite a bit of anxiety there. She was like, you don't have to think about gratitude as sort of this big thing. Gratitude can be start with something small. I'm grateful that I have sunglasses so the sun's not in my eyes. I'm grateful that I have a chair to sit on so I'm not sitting on the ground. Genuinely start with those things. I'm grateful that I'm having a conversation with somebody today where I get to feel connected. I'm grateful that the sun's out. Little things here and there. Um, and start to just sort of ground yourself in that gratitude because those things are very real, right? They're tangible things. I think sometimes we mistake the concept of gratitude for, to your point, sort of like, thank you for this. That does exist. I have gratitude for people, right? But I think some of what's most important is for us to be able to recognize the little moments, the day-to-day things or minute-to-minute things that are happening where we can experience a little bit more peace, a little bit more calm within ourselves. And so I just got in this habit of, for me at the time when I really kind of dove into the practice of it, was I decided that I would build it around a routine. I think it was maybe a little unintentional, but this is how it happened. I feel like a lot of people have clarity of thought when they're like showering and stuff. So when I would get out of the shower, as I'm drying off, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to name 3 things that I'm grateful for. And it really helped almost in such a subtle way that I didn't realize how much it did until I wasn't doing it. And then I was sort of like, what changed that I'm not feeling as good as I felt before? And it's like, well, because I wasn't proactive in sort of expressing my gratitude or witnessing my gratitude for things. And so it's almost like once you start doing it and you develop this, you notice when you're not doing it. And then you realize I do have things to be grateful for. And so it, I think, becomes a lot easier to build that muscle back. And I really think that another piece of it that a friend of mine helped cultivate for Nicole and myself when she visited last summer was this idea of daily delights. And
Mm.
so daily delights and gratitude. So a daily delight could be, oh my gosh, I saw this adorable puppy while I was walking in Fort Langley the other day and I got to pet it and, had a little quick chat with the people there. And it was really just a nice interaction that, was fleeting, but it brought me a moment of joy. And then a gratitude that I have is that, I had the time yesterday to be able to go for a walk and just give myself the space that I needed. Right. And so I think some of that is where I try to also like kind of make the differentiation between, well, this was a moment of joy and I can also be grateful for that moment of joy. But I think, even if what you're doing isn't necessarily quote unquote gratitude, is it just the ability to recognize that something made you smile today?
Mm. Yeah, I like that. I really appreciate you explaining it like that, because for me, when I hear this, like, oh, practice gratitude, it seems almost like you have to make this like either grand gesture, or you have to go through this whole process, like I kind of mentioned, like meditating, where it's like this sort of somewhat, you may look at it as an arduous task, right? Like going to the gym or something. I'll practice gratitude. It's like, oh, okay, well, geez, I better, got to go do got to do my gratitude for the next hour.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but it is, like you say, it's just a small little thing that can, and really change your day. It doesn't have to be this huge undertaking to, you know, just show a little gratitude for the little things in your life. I really
Yeah.
like that.
And something else I wanted to add too is that I'm a big fan. Part of why I renamed the podcast, Can I Just Say, is because I also really believe in complimenting people when you feel it in a moment. Like I will compliment a random stranger, sometimes to their surprise and then unsure of how to respond to me. But I typically lead with, "Can I just say?" And then
Mm,
and Nicole's like, and then people have to prepare for the nicest compliment they've ever received, which I think is funny. But it's just, for me, a way to express gratitude to other people is to have a "Can I just say" moment with them. I think it's meaningful to witness people and actually say it out loud. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people, I do think, from my friends and people I've spoken with, they think about it, but they think that it's going to be weird to say it. I don't have that. I don't
mm.
I don't filter on that because to me, most people, even if they don't know how to accept a compliment or don't feel comfortable accepting it, don't feel bad that you gave it to them, right? So I operate with the mindset of, maybe it'll make somebody's day better if I say it, but it also makes me feel good to acknowledge and to witness somebody, and hopefully that they receive that. And it gets back to I think it's for both people in those moments.
All right, Nikki, can I just say, you've been an amazing guest today, and I am grateful for the time that we got to spend together.
Thank you. I am as well, Graham. I really, really appreciate the conversation. You're a wonderful host. I really appreciate how thoughtful your questions were, and I feel like you've just got the vibe for it. And I'm so excited to just see how your show progresses and to see where it takes you, because I think it's a really exciting journey to be on, and I love supporting fellow podcasters as they're going through it.
One thing Nikki and I weren't able to get into was her notion of the ripple effect from openly sharing our stories, or from paying random compliments to those we meet. If you get a chance, next time you're out and about, approach someone with "Can I just say?" and pay them an honest compliment. Hopefully, they'll pass the good feelings along. Don't forget to follow, comment, and like Humdrummity on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, take care.